Right, there we go. Yes, so that's my talk today. You'll recognize the quote there from Jake Balakovsky, one of those old-type natural fouled-up guys. So it's a comparative investigation of Larkin's poetic persona and voice in the Whitsun Weddings anthology and in High Windows. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Before I do, though, I want to share a story with you, or a couple of stories. And as they say, you can't script it. You can't script things. I mean, I arrived earlier this week in Hull. I flew in from China at the weekend. The cunning plan was to arrive early so I would get over the jet lag before I give my talk. And of course, that hasn't worked. I'm still knackered. You know, I woke up again last night at 3 o'clock. So, you know, although I work in China, I don't usually look like a panda. But anyway. So you see me very sort of Chengdu-esque at the moment. But anyway, here's my story. So on Wednesday, I went over to the Princess Quay shopping centre for a wander around, as you do. And I went into a shop to buy, you know, some clothes, shirts and things, get my size while I'm back in the UK. And there were two shop assistants there, an older one, well, sort of my age one, and a young and very pretty one. And sound like Philip Larkin. And anyway, we're chatting away, and being the affable sort of chap that I am, I said, oh, I haven't been in Hull for 35 years. I was here as a student, and we're chatting away, and she says, oh, what are you here for? And I said, oh, I'm coming for a conference about Philip Larkin. Oh, right. And then anyway, the older one left, and the young pretty one remained, and she's bagging up my stuff, and she said, are you Philip Larkin? And I looked at her, and ladies and gentlemen, you do not know the temptation to have said yes. Are you Philip Larkin? And I said, no. She said, turds. And I said, I'm sorry? Oh, yes, turds, quite so. And the mind just boggled. I thought, why should I let the turd work spot on my life, it's been spotting on my life for years. But there you go. So that's a true story. It sounds apocryphal, but I promise you, God's witness, it's true. So that was my return to Hull. So I was last in Hull 35, 37 years ago. I came here in the 1980s as an undergraduate to do German and Italian. And a bit like Daniel was saying yesterday, back then there was no Larkin trail, there was no Larkin tourist industry, there was no statue in Paragon Station. If people had heard of Larkin, they kept it to themselves, So very, very different. It's been wonderful to come back and see those changes. I've been stumbling around this week, meeting contemporaries who were at university with me, and sort of going, But anyway, let me crack on. Enough of my gassing. Let's crack on with the main show. So, great, there you go. Click there. Right, just check. Okay, so I'm going to be comparing two anthologies, and the Whitsun Weddings and High Windows. I was introduced to the Whitsun Weddings pre-O-level, so we're looking at, what would that be, 1982, something like that. I think the first poem I ever read was Toads, or Turds, yeah. And I went on to do it for A-level, so you were right, actually, it was sixth form. And I loved it. I fell in love with Philip Larkin's work, and I've sort of remained in love with it. So I thought with the conference theme looking at High Windows, it would be quite interesting to do a bit of a comparison between the two. So as everybody in the room knows, Whitsun Weddings published in 1964, 32 poems. High Windows, 10 years later, a slimmer volume of only 24 poems. So that's an immediate difference. And I thought it would be interesting to look at the themes. What themes appear in both of the anthologies, and are there any differences? Are there any things that change or emphases? So, with a disclaimer that it's probably quite subjective, some of you in the audience might disagree with my categorization, but I came up with what I think are 12 themes. And let me just try not to throw it all over myself this time. Get my water. Sorry. So yeah, so you can read them there. These are what I would say are the main 12 themes, which cut across both anthologies. So you can read them for yourselves. Let me just go through these. So the first one, think about journey landscapes and particular places. Whitsun Weddings has got quite a lot of that going on. Obviously, we've got here about Hull, the Whitsun Weddings itself, journey down to London. The asterisks ones are ones that could be cross-referenced, they could be appearing in another category. So anything with an asterisk on, you'll see it appear again under a different heading. But so journey landscapes here, the Whitsun Weddings, the large cool store. I was depressed to see that the large cool store is now the job centre. I noticed on Whitefriar Gate, Marks and Spencer's is no more. So the importance of elsewhere, one of my favourite poems, and of course in Arundel Tomb. Contrast that with High Windows, and it's a bit less. Got 3 there. Friday Night in the Royal Station Hotel, Dublin-esque, and of course Show Saturday. So these are poems about either journeys or particular places. Second theme, the most obvious Larkin theme perhaps, age, passing of life. Whitsun Weddings, lots of that in Whitsun Weddings. Dockery and Son, reference back, afternoons, again those last 3 asterisks because they can be arguably put into a different category. Love songs in age. Contrast with High Windows, and it's close to even Stevens, actually. Sad Steps, Forget What Did, How Distant, and The Old Fools. Death, fear of death. Lots of that in the Whitsun Weddings. We heard some of these poems yesterday, Nothing to be Said, Ignorance. Somewhat surprisingly, in High Windows, there's really only one poem, I would say, that deals directly with death or fear of death, The Old Fools. Perhaps The Building as well, maybe could be classified as that, but I would say there's less of a focus on that in High Windows. So yes, The Building as well. Things that are recognisably English artifacts or events. 3 things, I think, in the Whitsun Weddings stand out. Obviously, the Whitsun Weddings, the whole idea of marriages at Whitsun, very English. Essential beauty. I've been struck over the years how we just don't see these advertising hoardings anymore. I spotted one at the bottom of Newland Ave earlier this week, but you just don't see them as much as you used to in the 70s and 80s. But in High Windows, I think we've got 2 poems that are particularly about English events. We've got To the Sea and we've got Show Saturday. The 5th category is a bit of a slippery one in some ways, because some of Larkin's poems, I think, fall into this sort of space of something quite abstract, either about nature or abstract symbolism. So days, water, or if we look at High Windows, solar and the trees, or cut grass, or money. So again, even Stevens there, 4-4. Historical references. We've got 1914 in the Whitsun Weddings, and the explosion corresponds quite nicely, I think, to that in High Windows. Work, well, we've got Turds Revisited in the Whitsun Weddings, and livings, of course, in High Windows, looking at all those different types of work, the lighthouse keeper and the dons sitting around the fire and things, dealing in feeds, the farmers. This is an interesting category, I think, social commentary, satire, or politics. There's not a huge amount of that in the Whitsun Weddings. I mean, as a O-level student and then A-level student reading Naturally the Foundation Will Bear Your Expenses, I didn't really get it. Now, as an academic who does this sort of thing, I do get it, flying around the world giving conference papers. But there's not an awful lot of social commentary in the Whitsun Weddings. Sonny Prestatyn being maybe the most obvious. But if you look at High Windows, that type of poem takes off big time. Just do the maths there, it's about 8-3, isn't it, or 7-3. Many more poems dealing with satire or social commentary. Illness and health, ambulances, contrasted perhaps with The Building. dedications for Sidney Bechet, corresponding perhaps to the card players. What I'm calling ironic image of self. If you look at the Whitsun Weddings anthology, these are the poems that I think where we hear Larkin being more autobiographical. Mr. Bleaney, one of my favourite poems, Send No Money, Study of Reading Habits, Wild Oats, about his relationship with Ruth. Lots of Larkin himself coming out there. But then if we contrast that with High Windows, there's many more poems there, I think, that are ironic image of self. So Posterity being an obvious one, Vers de Société another one. Now this is an interesting one, love and relationships. When I tell people that I like Philip Larkin, and usually there's a scowl, we were talking about this, people say, misogynist or whatever, or you're sexist, or you're just miserable. Nobody equates Philip Larkin with love, usually. But actually there's quite a lot of love going on in Larkin, as everyone in the room I'm sure knows. I mean, if you look at the poems, especially the Whitsun Weddings, there's a lot going on about love, and some of his most beautiful poetry, I think, is dealing with love and relationships. So Broadcast, Faith Healing, obviously, a love poem. Afternoons, Talking in Bed, all the ones I've listed there. But just have a look at what happens in High Windows. Arguably, when I was first sort of compiling this list, I thought there's no poems that deal with love in High Windows or relationships. Then I looked a bit closer and thought, well, okay, arguably, you could say Annus Mirabilis kind of deals with relationships, but not in the same way as the poems in the Whitsun Weddings. So this idea of the poetic voice and persona changing, I think we can see it when we look at these collections of poems, the way these themes are being dealt with. So I kind of summarize what I've just said, give you a bit of a comparative frequency, Hey, I'm a linguist, I work with corpora. But somewhat subjective, I would agree, but that's the sort of breakdown. Now, I've highlighted in red the areas that I think are interesting. So death, fear of death, it's 4-2 in favour of the Whitsun Weddings. Particularly English artifacts, I've got 3 for the Whitsun Weddings, but I've asterisked them because I think they're debatable whether they actually do fully belong to that. Satire, I said already, High Windows wins, 7-3, quite a big win there. Ironic image of self as well, High Windows wins with a 7. Love and relationships, the Whitsun Weddings charges home, 8-2. Pretty decisive win there. So let's talk through in a little bit more detail some of these things. So death, fear of death, Whitsun Weddings, I said those are the ones. High Windows, those are the ones. So yeah, the Whitsun Weddings wins. Recognizably English artifacts, I'd suggested 3 of them perhaps. So in this case, High Windows wins, I would say, with the 2. Social commentary and satire, definitely it's High Windows. High Windows has much more of that going on. More politically aware, and I'm going to reflect on why that might be at the end of the talk today. But definitely a lot more social commentary going on in High Windows than there was in the Whitsun Weddings. So, ironic image of self. The bulk of my talk today is really about this poetic voice and persona and how the poet sees himself, how that comes out. Let's get a few quotes up. So if we look at the way Larkin's voice comes out in the Whitsun Weddings, a few selected quotes here. When I read these, I find them very gentle. I mean, a study of reading habits, it says, the dude who lets the girl down, blah, blah, seems far too familiar. It's very gentle what he's saying. It's not so definitive. And if you look at, self's the man, just the rhyme meter of that is quite whimsical. Oh, no one can deny that Arnold is less selfish than I. Da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da. It's got a nice whimsical sort of thing with it. It's quite gentle, I think, the ironic image of self in the Whitsun Weddings. Contrast it with the image of self in High Windows. And it's a different ball game. You know, we've gone from, oh, this anti-hero seems far too familiar, to they fuck you up, your mum and dad. You know, quite a dramatic change. And really quite embittered. If you look at the quote at the bottom right there, you know, get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. You know, it's hard to read that, particularly me now as a parent, especially to read that and not sort of go, ooh, God, you were feeling miserable when you wrote that. Compared to the Whitsun Weddings, which was much more positive, I think, even when he's being quite ironic. So I do think, as I said, the poetic persona, by the time we get to High Windows, has become significantly more embittered, grouchy, unhappy. And there's a paradox there, because, of course, by the time Larkin published High Windows, he was at the height of his fame. He'd made it. You know, High Windows sold out almost immediately when High Windows came out. So you've got this paradox that although he's massively successful, he's also massively miserable. And I think part of the reason for that was his view that poetry had left him by then. I was talking to someone, this is a few years ago now, and she was saying that his friend Ted Tarling had seen him banging the chair and saying, I just can't do it anymore. It's left me. So his bitterness, perhaps, is because he felt that he'd lost his poetic skills, you know. So ironic image of self. What about love and relationships? Well, if we look at the Whitsun Weddings, I think I said earlier, to me, some of the most beautiful lines from Larkin's poetry come under this category. You know, in everyone there sleeps a sense of life lived according to love. Beautiful. All they might have done had they been loved. Our almost instinct, almost true, what will survive of us is love. All beautiful, all you know, really quite positive, I think. Contrast that, excuse me, contrast that with High Windows. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, or the other one there from High Windows. Significantly more embittered, significantly more miserable. We know from the various biographies, from James's writing and Andrew Motion's writing and the letters, we know what was going on in his private life. So we've got an insight into why he might have been feeling a bit disenchanted with love by this time. We didn't have that privilege when High Windows was published. We had to just take it at face value. But significantly more embittered, significantly more miserable. So, watch my time. Some closing observations and a conclusion of sorts. I mean, it isn't really a conclusion. But the first thing that jumps out at me from reading the two anthologies is that if we compare High Windows with the Whitsun Weddings, in the case of High Windows, famously, we suddenly see an awful lot more four-letter Larkin, which, of course, students love. But, you know, we see much more. There's almost none in the Whitsun Weddings. I think the closest is in Sonny Prestatin when he talks about, you know, huge tits and a fissured crotch. That's as dirty as he gets. But in High Windows, suddenly we've got pigs' arses and piss, as we mentioned yesterday, and they fuck you up and all of that. And it's interesting, I think, to reflect on why that is. Why did he suddenly become so much more profane? I mean, I'm not shy about swearing. Anyone who knows me, I swear far too much, so I'm not a shrinking violet about swearing. But I'm interested in why his poetry suddenly uses more four-letter language. And I think there's various things we can attribute to that. Part of it, I think, is zeitgeist, the 70s, that it's just more acceptable then. I mean, I can remember the 70s, obviously. So more acceptable, so he was in keeping with it. But I also think that there's an element here of Larkin being Larkin, playing to the crowd, if you like, playing to that public persona, the archetype that David Quantick talked about yesterday, that it was kind of what people expect of Larkin, to be a miserable sod. So, okay, I'll be a miserable sod in spades then, and I'll swear more to show it. So I think there's those two things. But I also think that genuinely, as the sort of the center of my thesis here, that he was more embittered, he was more unhappy, and the kind of language he's using reflects that. The second point I would make is that if we compare the persona, the poetic persona and voice in the two anthologies, again, this idea of being embittered, it's much harsher in High Windows. And it's not just about the four-letter language, you know, as I said before, get out as early as you can. It's hard to find anything redeeming in that or positive. It's pretty dark. And of course, the love that I mentioned, compared to High Windows, that optimism has just faded away into sort of bitter cynicism, really. We've gone from what will survive of us is love to, you know, sexual intercourse started and it was too late for me. So I think there's a real contrast between the two anthologies. And I have to say, I mean, just a personal observation now, if High Windows was Philip Larkin's only output, the anthology, I don't think I'd be here today. I don't think I would be such a big fan of Philip Larkin. I mean, probably committing heresy, admitting this at a conference, I'll get lynched. But it's never spoken to me as much. There are individual poems that I like in High Windows, but as an anthology, it doesn't reach out to me in the way that the Whitsun Weddings did and still does and probably will forever. So that's just a personal observation. So I'm very mindful of time, 20 minutes. I didn't want to go over, so thank you for listening. A few sources there for further reading, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, ones to look at again and read some of that. But thank you very much for listening. And if anyone would like my slides, you're welcome to email me. My email is on there. If anybody would like to have a copy of these, I'm perfectly happy to share. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.